My name is John Garcia. I'm the financial aid director here at the MSU College of Law. We'll spend just a few minutes here. We'll take kind of a very, um, kind of macro level at the financing piece of it. It's a very early stage for most of you. I'm sure that the financing part of it is not necessarily something that's the top of your list right now, but we hope that it does at least become a more important piece as we kind of go over the next few months. And we'll have other opportunities to interact, whether that's through other webinars or our visit programs or you coming in one-on-one, phone calls, emails. We'll kind of cover all that territory. Doing financial aid for a long time. So I've also been at the College of Law for about 13 and a half years. We are kind of undergoing some integration with MSU. You may have heard about a little bit of that. If you have questions, I can try to answer. I will do my best. But that wouldn't necessarily be the majority, of course, of our conversation today. So what we'll talk about is kind of the cost of attendance, the budget that the school uses to calculate the amount of financial assistance it can offer to a student. We'll talk about a bigger piece of that, which is budgeting kind of on the individual level. That is, what can a student do to kind of prepare themselves to move from perhaps a working world or maybe the undergraduate world or something else into law school and do that successfully. We'll talk a little bit about high levels of debt. It is possible, it's not always the case, that students will take out a lot of loans to finance their legal education. But we have about 85% of our students taking a loan of some amount during the 3 years they're at least doing their JD. So again, we don't want to ignore that piece of it. We don't want to overemphasize it, but we will have a number of comments, or at least I will, of course, about that particular piece of it. We'll do a little bit of financial planning, which is kind of going back to the budgeting piece of it. I'll give you a few of my, I guess, what I consider experienced pieces of advice, and then we'll kind of open it up to Q&A at the end. So our cost of attendance, like most schools, consists of direct and indirect costs. Those direct costs aren't necessarily different from student to student, but they're paid directly to that school. So for us, that's usually tuition and fees for most students. We do have a number of students who live on campus, and so those charges are part of those direct costs, and their financial aid, when it comes in, will pay for those additional costs, generally speaking, as well. Those indirect costs, such as housing, books, and so on, those aren't specifically costs that you incur directly through the school. And just for an example, your books, we have an MSU bookstore right down the street from the College of Law itself. If you were to go in there and say, hey, I want to charge my books to my student account so I can get those books paid by my financial aid, that's just not an option. Unfortunately, you'd have to go in there and have a check or cash or credit card, something like that, and then you'd buy your books that way. And in some cases, students may want to look elsewhere to buy their books anyway. Our current year budget, so this is kind of across the board. This is our direct costs again and our indirect costs. The direct costs is of a lot of concern, I think, for most students because they want to know exactly what the tuition and fees are going to be. We don't have a lot of fees that we charge to students, thankfully. But it's about $44,000, almost $45,000 just for the tuition piece of it. And again, we are on a block rate. So if a student takes 10 to 17 credits in a semester, they're charged a block rate at least this year, which was $22,100. For a first-year student, we're rolling in the $200 RWA lab fee in these direct costs. And then there are a couple of smaller fees. Indirect costs is usually where students want to have more of that conversation. So those indirect costs, room and board, books, transportation, personal miscellaneous, that is about $18,000. So if we were kind of looking at this in a very kind of black and white sense, a student would have about $9,000 a semester to cover their living expenses. And that's a very important piece of the budgeting conversation overall, but again, something that I want students to be thinking about as early in the process as they possibly can. Again, these are the current year figures. Imagine they'll be changing a little bit next year. Perhaps tuition goes up. Imagine cost of living will go up a little bit. But if I'm looking at this in, again, very simplistic terms, I'm saying, okay, I have about 9,000, maybe a little bit more than that each semester, and I'm going to have to use that money to pay my rent each semester, pay for my books, get my cell phone paid, and so on. And then we do that kind of all over again each semester, right? So it's about $9,000 for fall's expenses, and then about $9,000 for spring's expenses. My first big piece of advice is that a student really start looking at budgeting as a good thing, as a good tool that will serve them well down the road, not just while they're in law school. And these may be things that you're already doing. If you are, I applaud you. I think this is a good way to get into the swing of planning out your money, planning out your finances, and making sure that not only can you do it right now while you're in school, but also when you're out there in the working world and you're doing it every day. And most of us are going to have to do that in some way, shape, or form. We do have a Excel spreadsheet that if you're interested, I could provide to you. That is kind of a budget worksheet of sorts. You may have something on your own that you like to use. But my second point here is to really think about considering those indirect costs and how they might be minimized or even adjusted in some way. My first thing here is consider a roommate. It's probably not something every student wants to entertain. I'm going to law school. I've had roommate situations before that maybe didn't turn out so well. And I don't necessarily want to do that to just save some money. We're not requiring you to have a roommate. We have some options for roommate matching through our admissions office. For example, there may be other options for students to kind of pursue that route as well, and that may be something that they want to discuss during their visit to the campus. How do students get by in terms of housing? How many students have roommates if we can provide that data to you. When you're selecting a housing option, foregoing something where you might have an outdoor pool or tennis courts or basketball courts. It is Michigan after all. We don't have a lot of outdoor swimming and tennis being played right now here in November, especially when it's about 23, 24 degrees today and the snow is coming down a little bit. All the more reason again to rely also on public transportation. If you're on campus or if maybe you're already an MSU student, you'll see the buses whizzing around campus pretty quickly. They go to a lot of different corners of the greater Lansing area and will get you here to campus in a pretty timely fashion. Costs you about $50 a semester to ride the bus with unlimited rides. And again, it'll get you pretty much wherever you need to go, whether that's on campus or perhaps even someplace off campus like grocery shopping. If you're thinking about assistance while you're in law school, here are just a few things. We don't have to go over these verbatim, but here are just a few things that I would ask a student to consider. What debt am I already bringing into the equation? And again, it may be consumer debt of some other sort, right? It may be credit card debt, for example, or a car loan. How is that kind of debt, or if I have educational debt from other federal student loans or even private loans, how do all those things factor into my future, my plans for my future? What kind of starting salary information can I find out there? If I'm going to devote 15% of my monthly salary to my loan repayment on my federal student loan specifically, how is everything else again going to fit into that? I still got to put food on the table. I have to have a roof over my head and so on. What if I wanted to do a different kind of repayment plan other than the standard 10-year repayment plan? How is that once more going to factor into what my long-term goals are, whether that's buying a home or getting married or something like that? What, again, personal financial goals do I have, and how might this either, again, assist it in some way, shape, or form? I might go to law school, and of course, the expectation is that maybe I'll be making more money, of course, after law school, but I could also have this additional amount of debt. How am I going to kind of make the two of them work? What can you do now? There are a number of pieces of that budget, that cost of attendance that the law school has, tuition and fees, room and board, and so on. What you won't see is that we're taking into account perhaps that, hey, we need to set aside some money for a student to pay other debts that they may be bringing into school, right? Their credit card debt, again, their car payment or something like that. Those are going to be expenses that the student's going to have to cover on his or her own. Those are expenses, in other words, that we're not going to include in the cost of attendance. We're not going to do additional financially because the student has to pay a $5,000 credit card bill, for example. If you are looking at incurring any kind of expense, that especially a large expense, let's say again a car payment, um, within the foreseeable future, really think about how you're going to manage that, and once more, the expenses of going to law school. If you can reduce those or avoid them, great. If you can start that law school savings account I talk about quite often, you'll hear me say that quite a bit. I would encourage you to do that now. Even if it's $100 a month, I mean, maybe it's just $50 a month, maybe it's even less than that. But is this money, in other words, that I could use to cover my moving expenses, because that's not something financial aid is going to cover? Is it money I could use to save up and try to pay down some of these other debts I might have before, again, I set foot on campus? Or maybe I'm in a really good position. I don't have those consumer debts, and I just simply want to have this law school savings account so I can, again, pay for my moving expenses, pay for my first semester's rent, or maybe my security deposit and my first month's rent when I actually sign a lease here in East Lansing, or maybe again the greater Lansing area. Where might you reduce your current expenses? Some of these things might seem very small, some might seem quite obvious. Just changing your cell phone plans, or maybe even your cell phone, right? Maybe I don't need the newest phone because I can make my old one last for a few years of law school. I think it'll do just fine. Eating out less frequently, right? Not stopping at our Sparties downstairs and getting a coffee every morning. That's going to add up, even if it, is just $3, $4, or $5 a day. And when you're preparing that budget for law school, what are you doing in terms of looking at those expenses you already have and that you're going to have in the future? Again, you're still going to have a roof over your head, putting food on the table, and so on. But there are some specific expenses you'll have as a law student, right? You're not probably buying textbooks right now. Maybe you are. Maybe you're a current student. But again, is there a lower cost housing option for me, right? Do I really need to have a single room in a brand new complex here in the area? And there are a number of those. What about a roommate or two or three? Is somebody already in law school here looking for a roommate? And might that be a good situation? Maybe that's a good fit for me. In other words, I don't necessarily want to look for a roommate who is, a second year student at MSU. I don't want somebody who's going to be partying all the time. I want somebody who's going to be in my same boat with me. And use textbooks. Again, I mentioned sometimes that students will either get a used copy down at the bookstore. Maybe they'll go out and search on the web or Amazon, something like that, and find a used copy of a textbook where they're saving, $20, $30 just by using that used version. And maybe you don't necessarily like that part of it either. It's possible. I like a brand new book just as much as anybody else. But again, if the cost savings is $30 or $40 on that book, and maybe I can get 3 or 4 books and save $30, $40 a piece, those are some, again, very substantial savings. My other very kind of strong piece of advice is that a student should really be looking at what their credit is. Once more, this may be something a student is already doing, and if you are, I again applaud you. But if you haven't ever visited annualcreditreport.com, I encourage you to do that, maybe even today. We have different kinds of loans that we administer. That maybe the first time you're doing a federal student loan, maybe it's the first time you're doing a private loan for your education. One of those federal loans is a Grad Plus loan. Private loans are going to be credit-based as well. You want to make sure that before you even start applying, you know what your credit looks like better than that lender understands your credit to look. So I think that there are very simple things that a student can do in that regard. Again, just making sure that the credit looks good, addressing any discrepancies, making sure that the credit and credit score are as good as they possibly can be before they kind of start to set foot on campus. Financial planning skills, I think, is another very strong area of interest for a lot of students. They don't necessarily always relay that to me, but as we have discussions, I'm very impressed very often that students are already doing this, right? They're already using budgeting tools in some way, shape, or form. They already know what the loan terms and interest rates are for any of the loans that they've taken on, whether that's prior to coming to law school or while they're in law school. There's a great financial literacy program started by Access Flex called MAX. It's free. It's free to our new students here. We'll be kind of advertising that a little bit more strongly in the upcoming months. But again, there are options out there. There are certainly other options, even aside from the financial aid office homepage, which again, I would encourage you to start your kind of journey down that financial aid road with that particular source. There are websites out there. I mentioned Access Flex. There are apps. There are books. There are a lot of different resources that you have available to you, many of them free, maybe even checking out a book from the library, right? Uh, what could I do to improve my financial literacy? So as I'm going into school, the stakes are higher. I'm borrowing more money, or again, I'm borrowing this kind of money for the first time. If you might recall the tuition and fees part of that budget, right? $44,000 this year. That's a lot of money to think about borrowing. You probably, or you could have, right, some assistance, whether that's personal resources or something like that, maybe a scholarship from the school, for example, to help offset some of those costs. But again, these are things where I think a student really has a good opportunity to um, kind of ramp up their game, so to say, move into a different area where maybe they weren't as comfortable before, but now they're willing to challenge themselves and say, okay, yeah, I want to make sure I understand the A to Z of these student loans, the A to Z of budgeting and financing my law school education. It's very early on, as I mentioned at the beginning, for that kind of conversation to get very, very serious. But my point in doing a lot of these webinars is to simply plant seeds. I'm not requiring anybody to do anything. I'm not strong arming them, but I do want them to be as prepared as they possibly can be. And believe me, I could tell you a lot of different stories about students who, walk through my door and they appear to be very unprepared for law school and they've already started, and that can be a very difficult conversation to have. Again, if you have any questions that you want to type in, feel free to do that. Any chat you want to put in, that's fine too. I'll be checking both things. My kind of last slide here before we go back is if you're interested in a little bit more information about the MSU College of Law, our email and phone number are here. My email and my phone number are a little bit different. My email is finaid, FINAID at law.msu.edu, and the direct number to my desk is 517-432-6810. We do have a couple of other webinars coming. One will be next week and one at the end of the month. So if you're looking at intellectual property, you're looking at doing the dual degree program with Ottawa, we encourage you to, again, register for those webinars, and we'll be providing a lot of very good, relevant, useful information. We'll be recording these webinars too as we kind of go forward. So again, I don't know if there are any specific questions that folks had that they wanted me to try to answer. I am more than willing to do that. I've got my chat window open up here. There's kind of a Q&A piece of it too. If you have any questions, again, feel free to uh, type them in at this point. So Minky, that's a good question. So international students, and I'm glad you brought that up. I think for most international students, their options are sadly kind of limited, right? They're either getting funding from their home country, so to say, or they're getting some kind of assistance from the school, or both, really. Um, I have a number of students who use OSAP. I don't know if that's something that you've looked into, or maybe you've exhausted that funding while you were at UT. But we have a number of students from Canada, from Ontario, of course, specifically, who have used the Ontario Student Assistance Program. Now, we've had students from other provinces as well, Labrador, BC, all over the map, really, of Canada, that have come here and been able to obtain at least some kind of maybe limited funding from Canada, so that they can at least finance some piece of that education. But in the end, we're really asking that student to say, I've kind of got the funding in hand in some way, shape, or form, whether I've secured funding through my bank or some other, financial institution in my home country, or something else. I've got help from parents or something along those lines. But it can be pretty rough going. The only other option usually that I would have for an international student aside from all the resources that we have on our website. So on our website, we've got external scholarships and writing competitions and things like that. But usually a student is coming to me for some kind of loan, and I'm usually advising them to seek a private loan. But that private loan often is going to require you to have a stateside cosigner. Um, yes, we will be having a recording of this, and we'll be posting that. I'm not sure exactly when that will be done, but I would follow up with admissions, or they may be putting something out on their page specifically, or putting out something through email, I believe. But yes, we will definitely be putting this recording out once we're all wrapped up here. Um, if there are any other questions, again, feel free. We've got certainly time to answer anything else. Um, I do sometimes have veterans who ask me, how do veterans benefits work here? I don't know if anybody participating today is a veteran, but we are a separate campus from MSU for now. Again, we are going through some integration, and we'll be probably fully integrated at some point down the road in a couple of years, I suspect. Um, but if a student is a veteran and they want their benefits kind of activated for their law school education, I again strongly encourage them to contact me. And in fact, I'll kind of type in a few things here just so that students have my email. And then again, if they want to contact me directly, they can certainly do that too. Again, there's no specific number uh, um, uh, uh, where somebody would need to go through a panel or something like that. So if you have again any other questions, you can always and maybe it's a question of kind of a personal nature, you can always follow up with me individually. If you are going to be on campus, we can set up something where you and I can sit down and take some time to talk individually. If calling you works better, we can certainly set up a phone appointment, and I can give you a call and make sure that, again, I'm answering any questions that you have. It's a big endeavor. It's, again, very early in the process, obviously, but I think for most students, they're really thinking hard about this financial piece. Even if the participation in this particular webinar isn't as robust as some other webinars we've had and will be doing. I think that this is one of those questions that students really should be thinking about early on, to some extent, rather than, of course, waiting until the last minute. The other thing I was going to say to you, Dina, asking about the recording, is you could always reach out to me directly. Again, if you want to email me specifically, this is the Office of Financial Aid. I'm the only one in the Office of Financial Aid. So if you email this address, or if you, my personal email, I'll chat that in too. You can get a hold of me directly, and I can follow up and make sure that we get a recording, or at least I point you in the right direction to the recording. It's not a problem. If there aren't any other questions, again, I appreciate you for coming and participating. Again, we'll have some other opportunities to interact. It's only November of 2018, but as we go over the next few months and students start getting their decision letters and know what their scholarships are and things like that, I think my job gets a little busier. And that's always a good thing, because, again, I want to make sure that students understand as much as they possibly can as they kind of go forward, because it can be, again, pretty daunting when you start to think about how am I actually going to do this, and I'm comfortable doing it, and what does it really mean in the long run. So again, if there aren't any more questions, I'll sign off. Again, I hope you have a great day, and thank you again for coming.